Hello and welcome to BetaFlight Basics. This time we're looking at the modes tab. So I'm going to cover what most of the modes are, although some of them not in any detail. Mainly the main flying modes, why you maybe want to use them, and how you might set them up on your radio, and specifically how I set them up on mine. It's a pretty personal choice though, each to their own about how one would fly and the sort of environment and what sort of switches they might want to use. But anyway, let's jump straight into it here. So I'm actually using, so I have a blank set of modes, this concoction of just a flight controller and a receiver, which I don't want to get too close to the radio. And I've basically got a blank page for my modes here. So what have we got here? Some of them are pretty obvious and some of them not so much. Arming is a switch I use, and I put it over here on the left on this two position. Arm, disarm, simple as that. I keep it well away from all my other modes if I can, and that way I'm not going to hit it accidentally. So I'm going to add that in how I would do it, although I'll show you how I would do it, but I will also show you how I would do it if I was setting up from fresh. So I have arm on aux2 basically. Now the next one is angle mode. Angle is being able to fly the quad but not go on beyond an angle, and if you let go of the stick it will self-level. So I would always say in this sort of quad you don't want to fly it like that purposefully, but it's a mode I use if I'm just doing a quick hover on line of sight, just making sure it's okay. It's just a little bit easier for me. I also use it as a kind of, I wouldn't say a panic switch, it's more of a something's failed. So if I've suddenly lost video and I'm flying somewhere and I think I might be able to have the time to take off my goggles, put my glass on, attempt to find it in the sky, I can flick it into angle, I can get the stick into where I think is generally a stay level sort of position, and I can maybe, gives me a chance to regain control. Most of the time though I'm going around pretty low, pretty fast, so if I lose picture I will pretty much just dump it on the floor, but it's there if you want it. So horizon is the next mode, and it's another self-leveling mode, but the difference is instead of being limited to a certain angle like angle, with horizon you can go all the way over. Now lots of people use this and sort of figure it's almost as good as acro, I'll go with this because it will self-level. I've always said I still go with it, don't use it, because it's fighting you. You're pushing forward but it wants to come back to level all the time, so you have to have your thumb all the way forward sort of on the stick to do things. So it's not a mode I like, and yeah, you know, if you want a safety margin you might want to use it, but I find angle easier in the terms that I don't have to worry about, like I can mash the stick anywhere and it's going to go over. So yeah, I like angle. I generally set angle up on my aux1 in the middle switch because my first position I generally use here, so I'm using this position is nothing, it's not enabled, which means it's acro or manual. That's my self-level switch, and then the next one down is a beeper. We'll come to this in a sec. So anti-gravity, this is a big feature that came out in maybe 317, I think 317, and it sounds very exciting. In reality it's not overly exciting. It's basically something that will up your eye gain in big punch outs, and the reason being is sometimes in a big punch you'll find that you lose your attitude somewhat. It sort of goes out or goes up like this as you going up. So what anti-gravity will do is as you punch out it will up that eye gain to stop you coming outwards, but in normal flight you don't want that increased eye gain and it will drop it back down again. So it's not a bad thing. Check it out if you want to. And the reason I mention it here is because on, I think some of my later quads, I think this guy here, what I've done is enabled it in a different way. So with two of these modes, the other one you'll notice here is air mode. If you go over to the configuration tab, and I've got motor stop enabled. It's just one of the things that I point out about my arming and stuff. But if we come down here, we'll find we can say I want permanently enable air mode, and I want to permanently enable anti-gravity. So let's say I want anti-gravity permanently enabled, which I'm still sort of messing around with. It's going to vary quad to quad if you have an issue during big punch outs about if you move, and you might want to test it to see how it is. And in many cases, you know, it's not going to make things any worse. So that's why this guy's got anti-gravity set up like this. Now if we go ahead and do that, and we just save and do a reboot, and we connect back in, and then if we go back to our modes, you'll notice that anti-gravity has disappeared here. And similarly, if I'd have put that air mode always on, then air mode would have disappeared from here. Pretty obvious stuff, but worth mentioning. Next few modes, I don't use them. I wouldn't necessarily suggest you would, but they are there, and as a quick explanation. Head free is essentially what many of these toy quads are called headless mode. That is, if I fly out like this, and I've got headless mode on, and I rotate it round like that, and I just literally bring my stick back to say come backwards, it'll come back this way. So it doesn't matter which way it's...
Telemetry lost.
Yeah, okay,
Telemetry.
so you're a bit close. Shh.
Tele
If you're facing this way, you pull the stick back, it comes this way. If you're facing that way, you pull the stick back, it still comes back that way. So it's, you know, it's a feature of beginners sort of trying to fly for the first time, and having that feature. Although I wouldn't necessarily recommend this sort of quad for that thing. That's why, you know, your 10-20 pound toy quads are available, so you can test them out and get a feel for it. So the head adjust mode goes hand in hand with that and allows you to set a new position as that is forwards away from you instead of that. Not something I'd use, not something I'd recommend. Beeper, however, is a very important mode because you're always going to be crashing and wanting to find your quad again. So yeah, I have that as my third mode on my Ox 1, which then looks like this. So I've then got acro,
Stealth level.
angle and beeper.
Manual.
OSD disable switch is basically a switch you can set up if you've got an OSD to turn it on and off. So if you don't like all that overlay on your screen, you can turn it off and then you can turn it back on again. Can't really see a great point to this unless you were trying to capture actual images through your FPV camera. In which case, you know, get an HD camera on there. Black box. Normally, if you've got a black box device, it will pretty much activate every time you arm the quad. But by having a switch on it, you can decide when to arm it. And if you're into looking at those sort of logs, it's something you might want. The failsafe switch basically replicates the failsafe settings. I don't really see a point to this one. If I want to do a failsafe test, I will. You could call it semi-dangerous. You could do it with the props off. Hold the quad, power it up, wiggle it around a bit, make sure it's running, turn it off and see what happens. And generally speaking, after a second, the motor should stop and it will start beeping, and that's good enough for me. No, it's not a really bad continuity problem. I was just editing this video and I'm just going to talk about air mode and switches in a sec, and I forgot to actually explain what air mode is and what it does. So air mode basically stops the props from shutting down completely. To explain, normally when we fly a quad and we want to do a manoeuvre, like let's say we want to hang upside down or we just want to do a flip or something, we would punch the throttle, would get that momentum, and then we might put the throttle down to 0 while we're upside down doing manoeuvre. While that throttle's at 0, if the props were to stop spinning completely, the quad would flip completely out of control. If you can imagine, if I was just doing a full flip, so I punch, I throttle down and start executing the flip, by the time I get to there and the props are stopped, this will just spin hopelessly out of control. What air mode does is run the props at a sort of minimal rate, high enough so they all keep spinning, but not high enough that it's going to really suck towards the floor. And then what happens, because they're spinning and the PID loop is still active, as you go over and you let go of the control, that PID loop will mean it holds that attitude, so it would arrest any rotation and hold you perfectly in that position. So this is why you often see absolute snap rolls that are just perfect and just stop at a dime like that. Because that PID loop's running, it can actually stop it for you. I'm going to talk about air mode in much more detail about how to set it up and what the effects are in my other tutorial series called Tips for New Quad Flyers, so stay tuned for that. But I'll let myself continue from yesterday talking about switch positions. Air mode I most definitely use, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing on my setup because I use Ox 2 for air mode on this position, and I use this switch, which isn't necessarily a good idea because it's right next to my arm switch. Very occasionally I've been wanting to disable air mode and I've gone ahead and I've disarmed my quad. It's only happened 2 or 3 times, but it's more embarrassing than anything. So you're probably wondering if I've got these both assigned to auxiliary 2, surely when I move my air mode switch to here, it will also be in the arm place, which is a bad idea. But you see, if I move it,
Air mode.
nothing happens. But if I then also activate arm,
Arms.
it moves in there.
Disarms.
And this is because I've got this set up on my Tyrannus as a logical switch, which means this won't engage unless that switch is. Now, that's kind of a historical thing. I don't know why I did that in the first place. I think I was short on channels. What I'd probably do now is I'd set this to being auxiliary 3, and then I'd always have my arm available. If I want to add air mode, I can do. Now, the reason I like to have air mode as a separate switch, some people sort of have a 3-position switch and it would be like acro with air and then something else. As air mode is basically a modifier, you can add air mode into acro, you can add it into horizon or angle or whatever if you want to. I want it to be there for any time I want it, but I also want to be able to switch it out easily independently of what I'm doing with my other switch. So whatever I'm doing here, I want to do differently over here for air mode. So my typical thing is, because I've got long grass where I fly, this is why I have motor stop enabled, because I don't want the props spinning up, and this is why I want air mode when I want to. So normally I'll be a case of arming, put to air mode, I'll take off because I know I'm in a good position, I'll fly around, I'll keep air mode on, and when I'm coming into land, I'll switch air mode back off again,
Air mode.
like that, and bring it in, and that way I know when I drop the throttle, and it's normally dropped fully by the time it even gets close to touching down, it means those props are stopped before they get anywhere near the grass, and that really works well for me. But yeah, logical switches, for some reason it's just me, and because I set that up once and I generally just copy the model between, almost everything's like that, so it's hard to come out of that now. FPV angle mix, this is a bit of a weird one. I must admit, not knowing anything about this and having a look at it before, not something I'd recommend. Basically, FPV angle mix tries to do stuff that you should be doing for yourself. So for example, if you say I've got FPV angle mix and my angle is 30 degrees, then it tries to take that into account as it yaws. So if you imagine a pure yaw here means that the camera's going to be weird. It's not going to rotate around its axis as if it was flat. But you should be putting necessarily roll and yaw commands in to give you this, imagine the horizon being flat. So what this attempts to do is, if you just yaw on its own, on your own, which would normally go up and like that, this tries to fill out the other side of it. Essentially it's trying to give you a coordinated turn instead of you doing it. So not something I would advise. Learn how to do it properly and then you'll never have an issue. Black box arrays is the black box. I must admit of not knowing anything about that, because I generally don't use black box. I don't know if plus 30 seconds is how long you have to have the mode on or what, but if you're interested, check it out for yourself. The camera control ones are quite interesting, although currently it takes a bit more wiring. It's essentially, if you've got one of these cameras with the OSD port, a bit like most of the Runcam Swift type cameras, then you can use this to actually use your transmitter as basically the joystick emulator on that little OSD thing that you get to be able to go in and change settings. Now the Vortex quads have actually had this sort of thing on for a while. You've been able to go in and change the settings in the camera, but they're using their own methodology of doing it. This is the BetaFlight one, and perhaps it's become more popular with flight controllers coming out which will allow this. It's not a bad thing to do, although I generally find myself setting up the camera once when I first get a quad and never needing to again. But if it was more commonplace, perhaps people would get on and do it more if they had change of conditions and wanted to change some bits about. And my camera just ran out of battery, so if the continuity is slightly shifted, not my fault. Flippo crash, or turtle mode as it's called. What's that all about? One of the most famous features of BetaFlight 320, the ability to flip your quad back up. To get this, you need to be running D-Shot. If you're not running D-Shot, it simply won't work. So if I went into here and I said I'm running 1-shot 42, . and then back in I mode, you'll notice it's disappeared, it's not there anymore. So yeah, D-shot commands are important on that one, and this means you have to have a certain level of BL Heli S, which is 16.67 or above, which is quite a lot of little bits and pieces you need. Now, it's a cool thing. Usefulness depends very much on where you fly. As I said, I have a lot of long grass, and my worry that if I'm upside down, then I'm literally just in grass, and if I try and start motors up here, you've got a chance of overheating something and it's not going to come back. I'm also always worried if I'm carrying a GoPro or something and I've had a crash, that might have come off. And even when I crash and I'm this way down, sometimes I think, actually, let me just go and get it, because that's a reference point for where my camera might have come off. So it's very cool, but it's not, you know, it's not a get out of jail free card in all occasions. It kind of depends. Finally, down here we got the pre-arm command. This is kind of a two-stage arming thing. So some people think having just a single arm switch is a bit dangerous, and I suppose it could be if you've got like air mode on.
Telemetry lost. Telemetry recovered.
Shut up. If you've got air mode permanently on, and you flick that switch, then the props are going to spin, and you don't want to be near those. One of the reasons I have motor stop enabled. So this is like a second level arming thing. So if you've got this set, let's say pre-arm was this switch, you'd have to go to pre-arm and then arm before the quad would actually arm. If you tried to arm before pre-arm, it just wouldn't work. So it's a second stage safety thing. So not a bad general thing to know about. So just to go through this again, and what I'll do, I'll set up as I would do. So what I have for me, and it works quite well, is my aux1 switch here is, don't touch it, it's in acro or manual. Center position is angle, final position is beeper.
Manual.
Over here I've got my arm switch and my air mode on or off.
Disarmed.
Obviously the way of setting this up is, as I've alluded to, is basically you just have your particular aux you want, and then you can set the range you want, and you can set these ranges as big or small as you like. So if you wanted to, you could use a single aux channel and put lots of different things on there. You could literally put little tiny ones and just keep adding to it and have all these positions if you really wanted it, and you can get rid of them like that. But to be honest, I don't find it really necessary to have more than I've got. Of course, when you're setting this up, you should absolutely have your radio on and a battery plugged in. Don't forget, don't have any props on, which is not a problem for me because I haven't got a quad there. But make sure, of course, that when you move your sticks, your switches, that the little blob here actually goes in the right place. So angle goes to angle, beeper goes to beeper. When I turn it off, nothing's activated, and air mode is that one. It's as simple as that, really. Not too much to it. You can go super complex if you really want to, but I find in this type of quad you really just need a couple of things, and most importantly, that's to be able to arm it, a beeper, and maybe a flight mode or two. Well, I hope that's helpful, and of course any questions, and just stick them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. I will catch you in the next one. Bye for now.